Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Glenn Cantave,
I'm Idris Brewster.
and it is a pleasure to be here today. So our team, we are called Movers and Shakers NYC, and our mission is that we use augmented reality to write Black and Brown history into American curricula. Now, the fundamental issue that we're addressing here is that whether it's in our monuments, our public spaces, our school curricula, our cultural institutions, or traditional media platforms, there has been an intentional and systematic process of erasure, alteration, and whitewashing of Black and Brown history. And this process in itself has been a successful war tactic. This process of dehumanization, it's existed throughout centuries, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's wars with ancient figures in societies. They always say that it's the victors who write the history. And Black and Brown folks, especially to this day, are feeling the intense effects of that. And so the problem that we're addressing here is something that Idris and I have lived through since we were kids. I remember in first grade, we learned about Christopher Columbus's boats. Every kid in America learns about these boats and this figure. And you learn about the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, but our teachers never told us about the Taino slaves that were at the bottom of those boats as they were going back to Spain. And so we see that at the end of the day, there are just blatant contradictions at the foundation of our contemporary society in the United States, whether it's the fact that we have two people who are honored with national holidays, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Christopher Columbus. One is a genocidal maniac colonizer, the other literally gave his life to emancipation. The fact that the founding fathers were also slaveholders who would have owned people like Idris and I. And so in order to advance this conversation on racial equity that we have to have, we have to hit at these contradictions at their core. And so we decided to take the approach from the monuments conversation that was happening. Next slide. So what you see here is an image that went viral, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. It's in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017, when Nazis and Klansmen arranged with tiki torches to protect statues of General Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And what happened as a result was an international scandal, in the sense that people started to see at face value America when you start to kick the tires and understand the narratives that are at the foundation. And so what this really said to us was that, there is so much fragility behind these narratives, and there's power behind these narratives. And within that power lies the key to unraveling systemic racism. And so we took that mentality, that approached these findings, and we applied it to our own city. Next slide. And so we started off as a scrappy activist and artist collective. And what we would do is we would engage in a campaign to advocate for the removal of racist statues in New York City. And so we did various performance protests and teach-ins throughout the city to apply pressure to Mayor de Blasio's Monuments Committee. We did everything from a slave auction performance piece to tie Christopher Columbus to the genesis of the transatlantic slave trade. At one point around the New York City Marathon in chains. You see Idris and I on the bottom left corner there, protesting for a recontextualization of the Museum of Natural History on their anti-Columbus Day tour. And at the end, we learned a couple of things. Next slide. We learned in this process that augmented reality was a very interesting way to engage the public in meaningful ways. So right here was a teaching that we did at Columbus Circle. We would have an installation of that told the true story of Columbus, and we saw value in condensing information from thick books that most people do not read into something that's more engaging, that we thought that children and adults would want to engage with for fun or for pleasure. Next slide. So the scope of the issue is that nationwide, there's more than 5,100 statues of people. There are more than 700 Confederate monuments that would have owned people like Idris and myself. And less than 400 of these monuments are women. And in New York City, it was no better. At the time, there were 155 men, there were 6 women, and 23 animals. And so, you know, it's an expensive issue and a bureaucratic issue in terms of rectifying this egregious discrepancy. And we started seeing a key insight there in terms of applying augmented reality. Next slide. And so while they refused to remove the statue of Columbus and they decided to put up 10 statues of women, it wouldn't really do much to rectify the discrepancy and push for the humanization that we were looking for. And so that's where the idea of kinfolk was born. We recognize that with augmented reality, you don't need permission to put up statues of Black and brown figures. You could just do it from the comfort of your own home or place them into public spaces. Next slide. And so that was the genesis of Kinfolk. Kinfolk is essentially an interactive anthology of Black and brown monuments that most people never learned about in school. And so we see it as a living, breathing movement in terms of a continuous collection of monuments that are going to be expanded over time in a similar way to how the Constitution is a living, breathing movement in itself. And one thing that we realized with our experimental usage of AR is that we wanted to avoid becoming one of those apps that no one downloads that just sits in a graveyard. And we realized pretty quickly, especially with the advent of COVID, that we could reach a level of deeper engagement in classrooms. Because with classrooms, you have a guaranteed audience. And if you use the augmented reality service like a carrot, where it's like, whoa, I've never seen this before. It's like, okay, now that we have your attention, let us introduce you to the story of Denmark Vesey or Ida B. Wells or Toussaint Louverture. And so with that, we'll play this video and we'll move on to the next steps.
In 2021, it's no secret that our statues, our money, even our textbooks have one thing in common. They're full of white male slaveholders. Movers and Shakers is launching Kinfolk, a free app featuring augmented reality monuments of Black and brown figures we should have learned about in school. We partnered with Netflix to include 4 figures featured in Amend the Fight for America, a docu-series that explores the legacy of the 14th Amendment. Now, the whole family can come together and bring monuments into your living room. You can make them life-size, read their bios, and discover hidden gems through our Kinfolk web archive. Download today in your app store.
And so in February, we actually released Kinfolk, as the video said, in collaboration with Netflix. And how this idea from like a technological point really started is that we really had an interest in reclaiming these public spaces and unearthing these histories in a really interactive visual way that married the physical and digital worlds. Our vision first was to create a geolocative augmented reality app experience where people can go to statues across the city, really go to parks and really get the history brought right to them. Like for example, if I went to Columbus Circle and I got there, then the augmented reality monuments that we would want to celebrate would appear right there. But as we were doing a lot of our research and experimentation, we realized that even though we're achieving parity in our monuments from a visual standpoint is extremely important, what really mattered was education. And what really mattered was bringing these stories to as many people as possible. And also partly due to COVID, we pivoted and changed the Kinfolk into an app that allowed people to activate their environments with their augmented reality monuments. All you have to do is take a device, recognize a surface, recognize your floor, and then you can place any one of the 10 augmented reality monuments that we have. And the way that we've created these monuments is actually extremely interesting. I think every monument is created within a headset created by our partner, Micah Milner, using a program called Quill. And so you have, in one hand, you're in the headset, you have your brush in one hand and your palette in the other, and you're 3D sculpting each piece of this monument and stroke by stroke. And so essentially each of the monuments takes about 100 to 200 hours to create. And so we put a lot of love into these monuments. And so when we released our first monuments, we released it more traditional looking monuments that had generative animations all around. And then we had really wanted to make this an engaging way for students to travel the archive, make primary sources more interesting, really meet the children where they're at, because at times at home, the students are engaging with TikTok, playing Fortnite, FaceTiming with their friends, really visually engaging in interactive forms of learning and taking information. But when they're at school, they're faced with textbooks, static textbooks. And when they use their iPad, they're using their iPads for Google Docs and writing notes. And so we really wanted to leverage the technology that is actually in a lot of schools today to really make interacting with Black history fun and engaging. So we're trying to really do two things here, and it's making this history accessible, but it's also really empowering students in Black and Brown communities to be engaged with new forms of technology, basically the technology of the future. And so while we released traditional looking monuments for our first set in February, for Juneteenth, we released a set of 4 new monuments focusing on Black resistance. These monuments were Zora Neale Hurston, Harry Belafonte, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Denmark Vesey. And we really wanted to innovate in the ways in which what we consider a digital monument. And we wanted to do something a little different than what we did last time. And so what you see here is what we've called a portal. And it's actually a two-sided engagement or two-sided experience, where on one side you'll see an actual bust, life-size bust, even maybe larger than life-size bust of the monuments. And then if you walk around the back of the monument, then you'll actually see a scene that represents an important point in these figures' lives. And so while building out these AR experiences for education, we realized that we needed more engaging, more visually stimulating experiences that spoke more specifically to not just the figure, but the histories they were a part of and the communities they were a part of. So we chose intimate moments in each of these figures' lives to portray. And so then once students have seen these engaging experiences, then we have the app layer there where they can go through our curriculum and traverse through our web archive, which we've built out at kinfolkhistory.com. And so our goal really here is to create, as Glenn said, an interactive archive, like ever-breathing archive for students to be able to learn about Black history, learn about histories from people that look like themselves. And the main goal is to really inspire and to empower. A lot of students like myself went to schools and didn't learn about people that looked like me until way later. It wasn't even until 11th grade that I had my first Black teacher who taught me about specific experiences, literature, and histories related to the Black diaspora. And so we want to use this new age technology in order to be able to inspire and get the kids write our kids into the future, write Black and Brown students into the future, and have them really engaged in learning unlike never before. And so our goal here is to spread this technology across all 50 states over the next 4 years. We want to affect the foundational approach of our country towards critical race theory and Black history in our classrooms. We want to make sure that children in the most impoverished areas have access to technologies so that they can broaden their scope of what they can do in the future and broaden their perspectives on how they relate to the future. And so we have a long ways ahead of us. And one of the challenges that we're really excited to face is the challenge of making such an experimental technology into something that garners everyday use and solves on the ground real issues for teachers. And so that plan is going to take us 4 years, and there are a couple of obstacles in the way that we have to get through, especially our country's reception to these narratives that they have been trying to intentionally bury and erase. And so we took the first step on getting these stories out into the public during the Tribeca Film Festival, in which we were accepted to this past Juneteenth. And so we actually did a walking tour where we stopped at different spots in downtown New York, which used to be a hub for slavery in New York City and the East Coast. So I'm going to share a little video that shows how we are trying to bring education from the classrooms outside into the public spaces as well.
On Juneteenth, 2021, movers and shakers came back outside. In partnership with Tribeca Festival and Onyx Studios, we held our AR walk to explore virtual monuments. The Kinfolk app brought Black history to life with interactive AR models.
We realized that with augmented reality, we could put up our own statues, and that's how Kinfolk was born.
The event started at Netherland Monument in Battery Park.
This monument commemorates when the Dutch stole this land from the Lenni Lenape people.
Then we went to the former site of the New York slave market, then to the George Washington statue at Federal Hall.
I'm a descendant of George Washington. Think about for a second how that came to be.
We ended the day at Washington Square Park as part of the Night Riders Juneteenth tour.
With Kinfolk, we're really trying to unearth these histories that clearly our city is trying to bury.
We're just getting started. More monuments to come.
And yes, I really am a descendant of George Washington. I figured that out like 3 months ago. And so this is like really personal for us in terms of really bringing these histories to light and fighting a fight that seems like an uphill battle. But we're dedicated to bringing these stories out to as many people as possible and as many schools as possible.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't know who my ancestors are, but somebody owes Idris some money. So anyway, so you look at the 1619 Project, spearheaded by Nicole Hannah-Jones, the New York Times writer, and the backlash that she's gotten just from trying to introduce the truth into our school systems, from the micro level to school boards and outraged parents, all the way up to a block of US senators that want to make sure that critical race theory never sees the light of day. This is literally what we're going to be up against if we're successful in realizing our vision. Next step. So you see that critical race theory has been banned in schools across the country. And one thing that we're considering as we're trying to realize our vision of 50 states across 4 years is that it's a tough labyrinth to navigate, especially because the system is so decentralized and each state has their own requirements and their own internal politics. So what we've been looking to do is trying to, navigate how we teach Kinfolk. So, for example, we have instead of just history lessons, we have ELA lessons as well. So as long as you're hitting specific standards for English reading and analysis and comprehension, there's a lot more flexibility to what you can teach. But what it's really going to require is a movers and shakers army for good. We're talking parents, teachers, administrators, people who care, that want to get the truth into, to see the light of day into our classroom. Next slide. And so our goal is to really galvanize the public and place these monuments into public spaces, hold teach-ins in spaces throughout the country so that your names like Toussaint Louverture and Denmark Vesey and Fannie Lou Hamer and Tupac Amaru are common names. The reason for this is because as a country, we, right before our eyes, experienced the largest movement for civil rights in recent memory. And there hasn't been much progress. And the reason why there hasn't been much progress is because we as a country lack the foundational knowledge and that is required to unpack racial equity at its core and reach tangible solutions. But we can't do it if we're still saying that, George Washington never told a lie. You know what I mean? And so at the end of the day, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. If we look in our ancestral archive and we use innovative technologies like augmented reality to attract people's attention and then bolster and then bring adults together into a room to basically deliver the message to the youth and to the public, we can really make a change. And so the way that we see this work is generational work. You look at the environmental movement and how most people didn't know what climate change was in the 70s. This was decades of persistent and consistent work that ultimately changed consumer behavior, voting behavior, diets, and how we move as a society in general. And there's no doubt in anyone's mind that climate change isn't a thing for the most part in society. We need to have that same conversation in terms of the landscape of racial equity. But learning is labor. And at Movers and Shakers, our goal is to take the labor out of learning so we can make it fun and accessible so that every Black and brown kid can see themselves in their history, and that every kid in this country can understand the rich diversity and how we're stronger together. And with that, I want to say thank you for holding space with us. And we're going to host a Q&A session in the hop-in room. So if you'd like to jump over to our Q&A session, it'd be a pleasure.
Just like a quick shout out to our team at Movers and Shakers, everybody working on it, and Pariah Interactive, who's been building all of our AR experiences. So thank y'all.